Sometimes the gods send us exactly what we need, disguised as what we fear most. The morning mist clung to the Norwegian fjords like the breath of sleeping giants, and Bjorn Ironwolf should have been heading home with his raiding party's spoils. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside a crumpled form on the rocky shore, a child, beaten and bleeding, her clothes torn by more than weather. What stopped his warrior's heart wasn't her injuries, but her eyes, ancient, knowing, impossibly calm for one so young. "I've been waiting for you, Bjorn, son of Eric, son of Magnus the Bold," she whispered in a dialect his grandmother might have recognized. "I remember when your grandfather fell at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but Magnus had died 50 years before this child was born." As he carried her toward his longhouse, Bjorn, who had spent 25 years perfecting the art of violence, felt something crack inside his chest. She reminded him of Astrid, the daughter taken by sickness 3 winters past. Yet this girl spoke of things no living soul could know, and when she touched his scarred hands, the old wounds stopped aching for the first time in years. Who was this child who seemed to hold the memories of the dead, and why did every instinct tell him that finding her would either damn his soul or save it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The girl weighed nothing in his arms, lighter than the chainmail that had pressed against his shoulders for 2 decades of warfare. Bjorn's boots crunched against the frost-hardened earth as he climbed the path from shore to settlement, each step echoing in the pre-dawn silence that wrapped around Ironhold like a burial shroud. His longhouse stood at the village's heart, its carved dragon heads glaring down at anyone bold enough to approach. The building had weathered 15 winters since he'd raised its timbers, yet today it felt foreign to him, as if seeing it through the child's ancient eyes had somehow changed its very bones. Smoke trickled from the central hearth, a thin grey ribbon that promised warmth and the bitter ale that had helped him forget too many sleepless nights. "What is your name, little one?" Bjorn asked, as he shouldered through the heavy oak door. "I have worn many," she replied, her voice carrying that same unsettling formality. "But the stones remember me as Saga." The name sent ice through his veins. In the old tongue, it meant story, or history itself. Inside, the longhouse stretched before them in familiar shadows. Weapons lined the walls like iron prayers, each blade holding memories of men who would never return to claim them. The great table bore the scars of 100 feast-night revelries, and the sleeping alcoves along the walls stood empty. Had stood empty since the plague took not just Astrid, but the wife who'd given him his precious daughter. Bjorn settled Saga onto the bench nearest the fire, noting how the flames seemed to dance higher in her presence. The strange markings on her arms, pale scars that formed intricate patterns like runic script, caught the light and held it, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. "You're hurt," he said, reaching for the leather pouch where he kept his battlefield remedies. "Let me tend your wounds." "These marks are not injuries, Bjorn Ironwolf." She rolled up her torn sleeves, revealing more of the mysterious scarring. "They are remembrances. Each one holds a story this land has told me." He froze with the pouch half open. "What land? What stories?" "Your grandfather Magnus died with 17 wounds, yet the skalds sing of only 12. The 5 they do not mention came from behind, from his own shield brothers who coveted his silver arm rings." Her small finger traced a pattern in the air above her forearm, where one of the marks glowed faintly. The earth drank his betrayed blood, and I felt every drop. The pouch slipped from Bjorn's nerveless fingers. Magnus the Bold had been legendary for his bravery, a hero whose death at Stamford Bridge had inspired 3 generations of warriors. But this child spoke of treachery, of secrets that should have died with the men who made them. "How could you know such things?" "I know the taste of every drop of blood spilled on this soil for 700 winters." Saga's eyes reflected the firelight like dark water. "I know how your wife Ingrid wept when she learned you had burned the Irish monastery, because her own grandmother had been born across that sea. I know why you truly started raiding, not for glory or gold, but because staying home meant listening to your father die by inches. coughing up pieces of his lungs. Each word was a blade between his ribs. Bjorn sank onto the bench beside her, his hands trembling like those of an old man. "What manner of creature are you?" "I am what your people made, though you never intended to make me." Saga reached out and touched his scarred knuckles, and again that blessed absence of pain flowed through him. "Every death feeds me. Every secret told to dying ears becomes mine to keep. Every drop of blood spilled in anger or fear or love soaks into the stones and speaks to me of those who shed it." The fire crackled between them, and Bjorn found himself studying this impossible child who claimed to be the living memory of his homeland. Her face was thin and angular, marked by hunger and recent violence, yet her bearing suggested royalty. She sat like a queen might sit, if queens were made of winter wind and old sorrows. "If you speak truth," he said carefully, "then you know what I have done, the villages I've burned, the innocents who died by my blade." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You know I am not a good man. Goodness and evil are human words, Bjorn Ironwolf. I know only what was and what is and what the stones whisper might yet come to pass." Saga's small hand tightened on his. "I know a father's grief can drive him to seek death in foreign lands, hoping some Saxon sword might grant him peace. I know that same father once carried a fever-sick child through 7 miles of snow, stopping every few steps to breathe warm air into her lungs. Tears he hadn't shed since Astrid's funeral burned his eyes. Why have you come to me?" "Because the remembering has become too much to bear alone," she said simply. "And because the land grows sick from holding so many secrets." Dawn was breaking outside, painting the longhouse walls with pale light that made the weapon shadows dance like restless spirits. Bjorn found himself caught between worlds, the familiar weight of his daily routine pulling at him while this impossible child spoke of burdens too vast for mortal minds to hold. "Sleep," he told Saga, rising from the bench with joints that protested each movement. "We'll speak more when the sun is properly up." She nodded and curled against the furs he arranged for her, looking suddenly fragile without those ancient eyes boring into his soul. Bjorn pulled his cloak tight and stepped back into the bitter morning air, seeking the comfort of ordinary tasks. The village was stirring to life around him. Smoke rose from a dozen hearths as his people began their daily battle against the killing cold. Ironhold had weathered many harsh winters, but this one gnawed at them like a starving wolf, the grain stores running low, the livestock huddled together for warmth, the very air sharp enough to cut unprotected skin. "Bjorn!" Olaf One Eye limped toward him, his breath clouding white. The old warrior served as Bjorn's second, a grizzled bear of a man who'd lost his eye to a Saxon spear, but gained a tactical mind sharp as any blade. The morning watch reports movement along the eastern ridge. Could be deer, could be trouble. It was the kind of decision Bjorn had made 1,000 times before, yet today it felt different, weighted with the knowledge that somewhere in his longhouse lay a child who claimed to know the secret death of every man who'd ever bled on this soil. He pushed the thought aside and fell into the familiar rhythm of leadership. "Take 6 men and check the snares while you're out there," he said. "If it's deer, we eat well tonight. If it's Eric Bloodaxe's scouts." He let the implication hang in the frigid air. Olaf grinned, his scarred face crinkling. "Either way, we'll handle it. That's what we do." "That's what we do." The words followed Bjorn as he made his rounds through the settlement. At the smithy, young Thorvald hammered red iron into arrowheads, his face glowing with sweat despite the cold. The boy had promise, reminded Bjorn of himself at that age, all eager fury and dreams of glory. Now he wondered what secrets the boy would create, what blood he'd spill that the earth would remember. Jarl Bjorn. Ragnhild the Wise emerged from her herb-scented dwelling, her grey hair braided with charms that clicked softly as she moved. She was the closest thing Ironhold had to a seer, a woman who read omens in bird flights and spoke with the spirits of the dead. "I dreamed of dark waters last night, of something rising from depths that should remain undisturbed. Another time, He might have dismissed such talk as an old woman's fancy. Today, with Saga's words still echoing in his skull, every shadow seemed pregnant with meaning. What kind of something? Memory given form, the past refusing to stay buried. Ragnhild's pale eyes studied his face. You know of what I speak, don't you? Something changed in the night. I can smell it on you like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bjorn forced his expression to remain neutral, but inside, anxiety coiled like a serpent. If Ragnhild sensed Saga's presence, how long before others did? How long before questions turned to accusations, before his people decided the strange child was some kind of threat? He moved on without answering, checking the grain stores where Gunnar the quartermaster showed him ledgers marked in charcoal strokes. The numbers told a grim story, enough food to last perhaps another month if they were careful, less if the weather turned worse. Bjorn had been planning another raid come spring, targeting the wealthy monastery at Lindisfarne. Gold and silver could be traded for grain, for survival itself. But now he found himself wondering what memories such a raid would create. What secrets would soak into foreign soil, and who might someday rise to remember them? We need that Northumbrian silver, Gunnar said quietly. The men are starting to mutter about hungry bellies and empty ale horns. Bjorn nodded, though part of him recoiled at the thought. Once, the promise of battle had thrilled him, the chance to prove his worth with blade and shield, to carve his name into the world through deed and daring. Those days felt like someone else's memories now, faded and strange. The truth was he'd grown tired of the killing, tired of the endless cycle of raid and revenge that defined their world. But what choice did he have? His people depended on him. 43 souls called Ironhold home, and their survival rested on his shoulders like a mountain of stone. As he walked back toward his longhouse, Bjorn caught sight of Astrid's burial mound on the hill overlooking the fjord. The small earthen dome stood alone, marked by the carved runestone he'd commissioned from the best craftsmen in 3 kingdoms. Every morning he looked at it. Every morning it reminded him of what he'd lost. What would Saga say about that loss? What secrets had his daughter whispered to the wind as fever claimed her? He didn't want to know, but he suspected he'd find out anyway. The scream shattered the morning stillness like a blade through silk. Bjorn's hand found his sword hilt before conscious thought formed, muscle memory from 2 decades of warfare taking hold. The cry had come from the eastern approach, high-pitched, desperate, carrying the unmistakable note of mortal terror. He sprinted toward the sound, his breath misting white in the bitter air. Behind him, he heard doors slamming open as his people emerged armed and ready. This was how they'd survived so many harsh winters, instant response to any threat, moving as one body when danger called. But as Bjorn crested the low rise that overlooked the main trail, what he saw made his blood turn to ice in his veins. Olaf One Eye knelt in the snow beside something that had once been a man. The scout Bjorn had sent east lay twisted at an impossible angle, his body bearing wounds unlike anything in Bjorn's extensive experience of violence. Long, precise cuts ran along the corpse's arms and legs, too clean for blade work, too deliberate for beast attack. The man's eyes stared sightless at the grey sky, and his mouth hung open as if frozen mid-scream. Found him like this, Olaf growled, his scarred face pale. Eagle went ahead to check the snares, came running back babbling about demons. Never seen the boy so scared. Young Eagle stood nearby, barely 16 and trembling like a leaf in a gale. When he saw Bjorn approaching, relief flooded his features. Jarl, there's something wrong with the forest. The trees, they're bleeding. Bjorn felt the world tilt sideways. Show me. They followed a trail of dark stains through the snow, past the familiar landmarks where his people had hunted for generations. But as they moved deeper into the woods, wrongness pressed against Bjorn's senses like a physical weight. The very air seemed thicker here, charged with an energy that made his teeth ache. Then he saw what Eagle meant. The ancient pine trees that marked the boundary of their hunting grounds wept crimson from their bark. Not sap, blood. real blood that steamed in the cold air and filled their nostrils with a copper tang of fresh slaughter. As Bjorn watched in horrified fascination, more drops welled up through the wood grain and trickled down the trunks to pool in the snow below. "By Thor's hammer," Olaf whispered. "What sorcery is this?" But Bjorn was remembering a child's voice, speaking of blood that soaked into stones, of secrets too heavy for the earth to hold. He thought of Saga curled in his longhouse, her strange markings pulsing with ethereal light, and understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. "We need to get back," he said, turning away from the bleeding trees. Now. They found the village in chaos. People clustered in frightened groups, pointing toward Bjorn's longhouse where an unnatural light flickered through the windows. Ragnhild the Wise stood at the front of the crowd, her herb charms clicking furiously as she gestured with gnarled hands. "The spirits are restless," she declared, her voice carrying across the settlement. "Something has awakened that should have stayed sleeping. I can feel it pressing against the boundaries of our world, like a beast trying to break free of its cage." Bjorn pushed through the crowd, Olaf close behind. As they approached the longhouse, he could see the light growing brighter, not the warm orange glow of hearth fire, but something colder, more alien. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, drawing him forward despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "Jarl Bjorn." Thorvald the young smith grabbed his arm, eyes wide with fear. "Whatever's in there, it's been getting stronger since dawn. My hammer rang false on the anvil, like the very iron was afraid. And look," he held up his hands, showing palms stained red despite working with cold metal all morning. The bleeding had spread beyond the forest. Bjorn's mouth went dry as he realized what was happening. Saga's presence was somehow calling up the memories held in the very foundations of their home. Every drop of blood spilled here across the centuries was answering her call, rising like ghosts to paint their world in crimson testimony. He stood before his own door, one hand resting on the carved dragon head that crowned the lintel. Behind him, 42 of his people waited for answers he didn't have. Before him lay a choice that would define everything that came after. He could walk away, gather his people, abandon Ironhold, and flee to distant shores where ancient memories held no power. It would mean survival, safety from whatever forces Saga's awakening had unleashed. His duty as Jarl demanded he protect his clan above all else. Or he could open that door and face whatever waited inside. Learn why a child who claimed to be living memory had chosen him, why the land itself was bleeding secrets into the snow. It might mean death for them all, or something far worse. Bjorn's hand moved to the door latch, hovering there as the weight of decision pressed down upon him like the winter sky. Bjorn's fingers trembled against the iron latch, the metal cold enough to burn his skin through leather gloves. Behind him, the murmur of his people's voices rose like distant thunder. 42 souls looking to him for guidance while he stood paralyzed by the magnitude of what lay before him. What kind of Jarl hesitates at his own threshold? The thought cut deep, carrying the voice of his father, Magnus the Stern, who'd ruled Ironhold with an iron will until lungrot claimed him. Magnus had never known doubt, never wavered in the face of danger. He'd taught Bjorn that leadership meant decisive action, that a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between victory and massacre. But Magnus had never faced anything like this. No saga told of Jarls who discovered living memories bleeding through the world's foundations, of children whose very presence could wake the dead secrets buried in stone and soil. Through the door's thick oak, Bjorn could hear movement, not the quick footsteps of a frightened child, but something that sounded like whispers, as if a dozen voices spoke at once just beyond the edge of hearing. The ethereal light pulsed brighter, seeping through the wood grain itself, and he caught fragments of words in the old tongue, names he recognized from his grandfather's stories, battles fought before his birth, oaths sworn and broken across the centuries. Jarl Olaf's gravelly voice carried a warning. The people grow restless. They need to see strength. Bjorn glanced back at the crowd. Fear painted every face, not the clean terror of raiders preparing for battle, but something deeper and more corrosive. This was the fear of the unknown, of forces beyond mortal understanding. He saw Gunnar clutching his ledger books, like talismans, Thorvald's blood-stained hands shaking as he gripped his hammer, Ragnhild's pale eyes reflecting the unnatural light that leaked from his longhouse. These people had followed him through 3 hard winters, trusted him to lead them through raids and hardship alike. They'd buried their dead in this soil, raised their children within these walls, built their lives around the promise that Bjorn Ironwolf would protect them from whatever darkness the world might offer. Now that darkness had found them, and he didn't know if protection was even possible. What if opening this door dooms them all? The thought struck like a physical blow. Inside lay a child who claimed to remember 7 centuries of bloodshed, whose very existence seemed to be unraveling the boundaries between past and present. What if bringing her here had been the gravest mistake of his life? What if the bleeding trees and crimson-stained iron were just the beginning of some greater catastrophe? He thought of Astrid's fever-bright eyes in those final days, how she'd called out for her mother who died years before. What if Saga's presence could wake such memories in the very stones of Ironhold? What if his daughter's voice might whisper from the walls, speaking of pain and abandonment, of a father too consumed by grief to save her? The idea made his knees weak. Some burdens were too heavy for mortal hearts to bear, some truths too sharp to survive intact. If the land itself was rising to bear witness against him, to name every innocent who died by his blade. "The men are starting to talk of leaving," Olaf said quietly, his words meant for Bjorn's ears alone. "Eric Bloodaxe's settlement is only 2 days' march south. Some think we'd find welcome there, at least until whatever sorcery this is burns itself out. Run." The word whispered through Bjorn's mind like wind through winter branches. Take them somewhere safe. That's what a good leader would do. But even as the thought formed, he knew it for the lie it was. There would be no safety in fleeing, not from something that claimed to be the living memory of the land itself. If Saga spoke truth about her nature, about the blood-soaked history that fed her existence, then every shore would hold similar secrets, every settlement built on foundations of violence and sorrow. And beneath the fear, beneath the crushing weight of responsibility, something else stirred in Bjorn's chest, a hunger he'd thought long dead, the same drive that had once made him a legendary raider, that had carved his name into the world through deed and daring. Not for glory this time, but for understanding. "When did you become such a coward?" The question burned worse than winter wind. Once, he'd sailed unknown waters in search of Saxon gold, had faced shield walls where lesser men would flee. Once he'd been Bjorn Ironwolf, the terror of 3 coastlines, a man who'd rather die than show weakness before his enemies. That man wouldn't hesitate at his own door. That man would face whatever waited inside, regardless of the consequences. But that man had never been a father, had never held his daughter's cooling body while plague stole her breath, had never carried the weight of 42 lives depending on his judgment. The latch felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Bjorn lifted the latch. The iron clicked with a sound like breaking bones, and the door swung open on hinges that screamed in protest. The otherworldly light blazed forth, forcing him to squint as he stepped across the threshold that separated the known world from whatever lay beyond. The longhouse had transformed. Where familiar walls should have stood, he saw stone corridors that stretched impossibly far into darkness. The packed earth floor had become something that resembled black glass, reflecting scenes that flickered and changed with each heartbeat. Battles fought on distant shores, funeral pyres burning under alien stars, faces twisted in agony or ecstasy or final terrible understanding. And at the center of it all sat Saga, no longer appearing as a bruised child, but revealed in her true nature. Her small form pulsed with veins of silver light that mapped across her skin like rivers of starfire. Her eyes had become deep wells that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of centuries, and when she turned toward him, Bjorn felt the crushing immensity of everything she had witnessed and remembered. "You came," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that spoke in the tongues of dead kings and forgotten gods. "I was not certain you would find the courage." Behind him, Bjorn heard Olaf's sharp intake of breath, the shuffling of feet as his people pressed closer to the doorway. But when he glanced back, he saw their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror. They could see only darkness beyond the threshold. This vision was meant for him alone. "What are you?" he whispered, though part of him already knew the answer would shatter his understanding of the world. "I am what remains when the blood soaks too deep to ever dry," Saga replied, rising to her feet with movements that flowed like water over stone. "I am the memory of every life taken, every oath broken, every innocent who cried out for mercy that never came. Your grandfather understood, in his final moments. That is why he called my name as the Saxon blade found his heart." The words hit Bjorn like physical blows. "You were there, when Ragnar died at Stamford Bridge. I am everywhere blood is spilled and sorrow takes root. But I do not often wake, Bjorn Ironwolf. The earth can hold much before it overflows. Your people have tested those limits." Around them, the impossible architecture shifted and changed. Bjorn saw flashes of Ironhold as it had been built, on the bones of an earlier settlement, which had been raised upon the ruins of something older still, layer upon layer of violence and conquest. Each generation believing themselves the first to call this place home. "The bleeding trees," he said. "The crimson on iron. That's you, isn't it? You're calling up the memories." "They were always there," Saga said gently. "I merely allow them to be seen, to be felt. Your people have lived their entire lives, walking on graves they never knew existed." Bjorn's hand found his sword hilt, not to threaten but to anchor himself as reality crumbled around him. "What do you want from me? Why reveal yourself now?" "Because the time of reckoning approaches. Your kind has spread across the world like a plague, leaving scars that run so deep they wound the very foundations of existence. And now those foundations crack." She gestured, and the glass floor beneath their feet became transparent. Bjorn looked down and saw the roots of the world itself, vast networks of light and shadow that pulsed like a cosmic heartbeat. But the light was fading, eaten away by spreading darkness that looked disturbingly like infection. "Every act of cruelty weakens the bonds that hold reality together," Saga continued. "Every innocent death opens small wounds in the fabric of what is. Alone they heal. But when they accumulate—" She shook her head sadly. "Something fundamental is breaking, Bjorn. And if it breaks entirely, there will be nothing left but void and screaming darkness." The magnitude of it staggered him. He thought of all the raids he'd led, all the monasteries burned and villages pillaged in the name of glory and gold. How many wounds had his own blade opened in the world's flesh? "Why me?" he asked. "Why not Eric Bloodaxe or Harold Fairhair? They have greater armies, more influence." "Because you alone carry the weight of understanding. You know what it means to lose innocence, to hold death in your arms and feel the world grow colder. And because—" Her ancient eyes grew soft with something like compassion. "Because redemption is still possible for one who truly seeks it. What must I do?" The question left his lips before conscious thought formed, and Bjorn realized that somewhere in the space between heartbeats, his choice had been made. There would be no turning back, no retreat to the familiar world of raids and glory. He had crossed a threshold that existed beyond mere geography, stepped from the man he had been into something else entirely. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences for his people, he would see this path to its end. Saga smiled, and for a moment she looked like the child he had first found bleeding on the shore. "Now," she said, "your true journey begins." The words hung between them like drawn blades, and Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling across his shoulders. But before he could ask what form this journey would take, the impossible longhouse shuddered around them. The silver veins beneath Saga's skin flared brighter, and her expression shifted from gentle compassion to sharp alarm. "They come," she whispered, her child's voice suddenly urgent. "Faster than I expected." "Who comes?" "Those who would see the old ways preserved at any cost." She turned toward the transformed walls, and Bjorn saw images flicker across their surface. Armed figures moving through the winter darkness. their faces painted with symbols he didn't recognize. The bloodbound. They have felt my awakening and understand what it means for their kind. The name sent ice through his veins. He'd heard whispers of such warriors in the drinking halls, berserkers who'd bound their souls to ancient powers, trading their humanity for strength beyond mortal limits. Most Jarls dismissed such tales as mead hall boasting, but looking at Saga's otherworldly form, Bjorn found his skepticism crumbling. "How many?" he asked, his warrior's instincts taking hold. 7. "But they are not as other men, Bjorn. Death does not hold them as it should, and their weapons can cut through more than flesh." Before he could respond, shouts erupted from outside. Olaf's voice rose above the others, bellowing orders in the tone he reserved for imminent battle. Through the doorway, Bjorn glimpsed his people scattering, some racing for weapons while others herded children toward the hidden cellars beneath the grain stores. "My people." He started toward the door, but Saga's voice stopped him. "You cannot protect them by meeting these warriors blade to blade. They will cut through your finest fighters like wheat before the scythe." Her eyes blazed with desperate intensity. "But there is another way. Others who oppose the bloodbound, who seek to preserve the balance rather than tip it toward chaos." "What others?" "The Thornkeeper. She has watched from the deep forest for 3 generations, waiting for someone worthy of her trust." Saga moved to one of the impossible walls, pressing her palm against stone that rippled like water. "She can teach you to see beyond the veil of the physical world, to understand the true nature of what threatens us all." The wall dissolved beneath her touch, revealing not the familiar interior of his longhouse but a passage that led into darkness. Cold air flowed through the opening, carrying scents of pine and something else, something that reminded him of the breathing earth itself. "A test awaits you there," Saga continued. "The Thornkeeper will not aid those who prove unworthy. But if you can demonstrate that your heart has truly turned from the path of violence—" Another shout from outside, closer now. Bjorn heard the unmistakable sound of steel being drawn, followed by a scream that cut off mid-note. Whatever these blood-bound warriors were, they'd reached his village. "Go," Saga urged. "The passage will take you to her sanctuary. Learn what she has to teach, and return with allies who can stand against what comes. And leave my people to die." The words came out harsher than he intended, but the thought of abandoning his clan in their moment of greatest need made his stomach twist. "They will not be defenseless." Saga's form began to shimmer, her appearance shifting between child and something far more ancient. "I can weave confusion through the attackers' minds, make them see phantoms and strike at shadows. But such protection comes at a cost. The more power I use, the more visible I become to those who hunt my kind." Bjorn understood. She was offering to sacrifice herself to buy him time, trading her safety for his people's lives. The weight of such a gift settled heavy in his chest, reminding him once again of the impossible stakes they faced. Through the mundane doorway, he could see Olaf rallying the defenders, positioning them in a defensive line across the village center. These were good people, brave people who deserved better than to die for mysteries they couldn't comprehend. But Saga was right. Conventional weapons would not be enough against enemies who'd transcended mortal limitations. He looked back at the passage she'd opened, breathing in the wild, green scents that promised ancient wisdom and terrible trials. Everything in his warrior's heart rebelled against fleeing while battle raged, but he was no longer just a warrior. He was something new, something that hadn't existed before this moment, a bridge between the world of men and forces beyond human understanding. "How will I find my way back?" "Trust in the land itself," Saga replied, her voice already growing distant as power gathered around her. "It remembers those who serve its deeper purposes." Another scream from outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Time was running out. Bjorn stepped into the passage, feeling reality shift around him as he crossed from his familiar world into something far older and more dangerous. Behind him, ethereal light blazed as Saga began her desperate gambit to protect his people. Ahead lay only darkness and the unknown. The passage swallowed Bjorn whole. One moment he stood on the threshold of his transformed longhouse, the next he found himself stumbling through absolute darkness that pressed against him like a living thing. The air grew thick and humid, replacing winter's bite with the deep, rich sense of ancient forest. His footsteps fell silent on ground that felt more like moss than stone, and somewhere in the distance he heard water trickling over rocks. What have I done? The thought struck him as the magnitude of his choice became clear. Behind him lay everything he'd built, his people, his hall, his carefully constructed life as a jarl. Ahead waited only uncertainty and the word of a child who claimed to be something beyond mortal understanding. But even as doubt gnawed at him, he pressed forward. Saga's final words echoed in his memory, trust in the land itself. The passage seemed to respond to his resolve, subtle luminescence beginning to emanate from the walls. Not light exactly, but something that allowed his eyes to distinguish shapes in the gloom. The corridor widened gradually, revealing architecture that defied explanation. Massive tree roots formed living buttresses overhead, their surfaces gleaming with moisture that caught and reflected the strange non-light. Between them, stone carved with symbols far older than any runic script created arches that supported nothing but shadow. As he walked, fragments of distant battle reached him, the clash of steel, shouts of pain and rage, the crackle of flame. Each sound felt like a knife between his ribs. Olaf could be dying. Thorvald, Ragnhild, all of them facing an enemy they couldn't comprehend while their jarl fled through mystical passages like some saga spinner's fantasy. No. He forced the guilt aside. This wasn't abandonment, it was strategy. If Saga spoke truth about these blood-bound warriors, conventional warfare would accomplish nothing but the slaughter of good people. He had to trust that whatever waited at the end of this path could provide real answers, real weapons against forces beyond normal steel. The passage began to slope upward, and the air grew cleaner, carrying hints of pine and winter wind. Soon he caught glimpses of actual starlight filtering through cracks in what he now realized was a natural cave system. The man-made elements fell away, replaced by tunnels carved by water and time through the living rock of the mountains. When he finally emerged into open air, the sight stole his breath. He stood on a ledge high above the valley where Ironhold nestled, but this wasn't the familiar landscape he'd known for 20 years. The forest below pulsed with veins of silver light similar to what had flowed beneath Saga's skin, connecting every tree in a vast network that stretched to the horizon. Rivers of luminescence flowed between groves like arteries carrying the lifeblood of something immeasurably vast and ancient. And in the distance, where his village should have been, strange aurora danced above winter-bare trees. Ethereal ribbons of blue and green twisted through the air, beautiful and terrible, marking where Saga fought to protect his people with powers that strained the very fabric of reality. Impressive, isn't it? Bjorn spun, hand flying to his sword hilt, but found no target for his steel. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on wind that whispered through pine boughs with sounds almost like laughter. The Thornkeeper, I assume? He kept his blade sheathed but ready, uncertain whether he faced ally or enemy. Such weapons will not serve you here, Bjorn Ironwolf. A figure materialized from between the trees, or perhaps she had always been there, and only now chose to be seen. She appeared as a woman of perhaps 60 winters, but her eyes held depths that suggested centuries. Her hair, white as fresh snow, hung with trinkets of bone and carved wood, and her simple robes seemed woven from mist and shadow, though I suppose old habits die hard, even when the man begins to change. She moved with fluid grace to the ledge's edge, gazing down at the distant battle. The child wastes her strength on confusion spells. She could end this with a thought, turn their blood to ice, stop their hearts with a whisper, but she holds back, still hoping to preserve something of the old balance. Can you help her? Help my people? The Thornkeeper turned, studying him with eyes like winter lakes. Perhaps, but first you must understand what you're truly asking. The power to stand against the bloodbound comes with prices that most cannot pay. She gestured to the glowing forest below. This is what the world looked like before your kind began their endless wars, when every living thing was connected, when death and birth flowed in natural cycles, when the land itself could heal the wounds carved by necessary violence. Bjorn stared at the network of light, trying to comprehend its vastness. And now? Now the connections fray. Each act of senseless cruelty severs another thread. The bloodbound seek to accelerate this process, to bring about a final darkness where only the strong survive and the earth becomes nothing but ash and bone. She turned back to him, and he saw judgment in her ancient gaze. The question, Bjorn Ironwolf, is whether you have the strength to become something your people have never been, a warrior who fights not for conquest but for preservation, not for glory but for balance. The aurora flared brighter in the distance. Time was running out. The Thornkeeper raised her hand, and the air between them shimmered like heat above summer stones. If you would learn, then you must first surrender what you were. Before Bjorn could ask what she meant, the world exploded into agony. Every life he'd taken crashed into his consciousness at once, not as memories, but as lived experience. He was the Saxon monk cowering before his blade at Lindisfarne, feeling his prayers die on bloodied lips. He was the Irish woman clutching her infant as his raiders burned her village, watching hope crumble to ash. He was the Frankish boy, who'd begged for mercy in broken Norse, receiving only steel for his pleas. No, he gasped, falling to his knees as 20 years of violence flooded through him. Stop this! This is what the child carries every moment. The Thornkeeper's voice came from everywhere, merciless as winter wind. Every death, every severed connection, every thread torn from the great weaving. You would stand with her? Then know the weight she bears. The pain intensified beyond endurance. Bjorn felt his sanity fracturing as hundreds of perspectives layered upon each other. Victim and killer, hunter and prey, all the same flesh crying out in unified anguish. This was his greatest fear made manifest. Not death, but complete understanding of what his choices had cost the world. Through the torment, he glimpsed the truth Saga had tried to show him. Each act of violence rippled outward like stones cast into still water, creating wounds that never truly healed. The blood-soaked earth beneath his village, the crimson that seeped from iron, the way children woke screaming from dreams of battles they'd never seen, all of it connected, all part of a vast injury he'd helped carve into reality's flesh. Let go, something whispered in his mind, not the Thornkeeper but the land itself. Release what you were, become what you must. The temptation to surrender, to let the pain stop, nearly overwhelmed him. How simple it would be to slip away, to join the voices crying out in his skull and leave this impossible burden to someone else. But as the aurora flared brighter in the distance, he remembered why he'd come. Olaf, Thorvald, Ragnhild, my people. Not just his clan, but all the innocents caught in the web of violence his kind had woven. The children who would grow up in a world where the bloodbound ruled, where every gentle thing withered beneath endless war. The future Saga and the Thornkeeper fought to preserve. I choose to bear this, he thought, forcing himself to stand despite the agony. I choose to carry their pain. Something fundamental shifted inside him. The voices of the dead didn't fade, but they stopped tearing at his mind like wild beasts. Instead, they settled into his soul like seeds planted in fertile ground, painful still, but purposeful. Each death became not just a wound, but a responsibility, a life he now owed to the world's healing. The Thornkeeper stepped forward, her ancient eyes bright with something like approval. The first ordeal is past, but 3 more await, each harder than the last. The mountain peak around them began to change, reality flowing like water. Bjorn found himself standing in a vast hall, whose pillars were formed from the spears of fallen kings, its roof thatched with the shields of heroes whose names had been forgotten by their own people. At the far end, 3 doorways opened into swirling darkness. Choose, the Thornkeeper commanded. The door of regret, where you must face the specific lives your blade has stolen and convince their spirits to forgive what cannot be undone. The door of sacrifice, where you will learn what you must give up to wield power against the bloodbound. Or the door of transformation, where the man you were will die so completely that even your own people may no longer recognize you. Each threshold pulsed with different energy. From the first came the sound of weeping, voices calling his name with hatred and despair. The second radiated a cold that had nothing to do with winter, the chill of absolute loss, of everything cherished torn away. The third sang with alien harmonies that promised wisdom beyond human understanding at costs beyond human reckoning. In the distance, the aurora was fading, Saga's strength failing. All three, he said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. The Thornkeeper's expression shifted to something like shock. That path has never been attempted. The trials are designed to be faced separately, over years of preparation. To attempt them in sequence, with no rest between, my people are dying now. Bjorn drew his sword, not as weapon but as symbol, the blade that had carved so many wounds in the world's flesh, and I will not fail them again. He walked toward the first doorway, where the voices of his victims grew louder with each step. Behind him, the Thornkeeper's whisper followed. Then may the land itself give you strength, warrior. You will need every grain of it. The darkness swallowed him whole. The door of regret slammed shut behind him, sealing Bjorn in absolute darkness that reeked of blood and burned thatch. The voices he'd heard from beyond the threshold now surrounded him, no longer distant but pressing close enough to feel their breath on his skin. Bjorn, Iron Wolf. The Saxon monk materialized before him, throat gaping where his blade had torn flesh. You remember me, don't you? Brother Aldrich of Lindisfarne. I was copying the Gospels when you came. More figures emerged from the shadows. The Irish woman clutching her infant, the Frankish boy, dozens of others whose faces he'd tried so hard to forget. Each bore the wounds he'd given them. Each stared with eyes that held not hatred but something worse, infinite sorrow. We trusted you would show mercy, the woman whispered, her child's face blue with smoke. We believed warriors had honor. Bjorn opened his mouth to speak, but found no words adequate to the magnitude of what he'd done. 20 years of justifications crumbled like leaves in flame. We needed supplies. They were enemies. It was war. All meaningless now, faced with the specific, irreplaceable lives he'd snuffed out. I cannot undo what I did, he said finally. I cannot bring you back or heal the wounds I carved into the world. But I can. You can what? Brother Aldrich stepped closer, his ruined throat weeping crimson. Become a hero? Save the world? Do you think noble purpose erases ignoble acts? The weight of their accumulated sorrow pressed down like a mountain. Bjorn felt his knees buckle, his carefully rebuilt sense of purpose cracking under the pressure of absolute truth. These weren't faceless enemies. They were teachers and mothers and children, with dreams now buried under cairns of stone. But as despair threatened to drown him completely, he remembered Saga's words. The land remembers everything. But it also forgives everything, if the price is truly paid. No, he said, struggling back to his feet. Purpose doesn't erase the past, but it can honor the dead by ensuring their suffering serves something greater than the violence that caused it. The spirits flickered, their forms wavering like candle flames. One by one, they began to nod, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement that he finally understood the true weight of what he carried. Brother Aldrich was the last to fade. Remember us, Bjorn Ironwolf. In every choice ahead, remember what your blade cost. The darkness dissolved, revealing the door of sacrifice already opening before him. Through its threshold came the smell of ash and the sound of everything he'd ever loved burning away. This chamber held no spirits, only himself reflected in mirrors of black ice. But each reflection showed him losing something precious, his sword arm withering, his memories of Astrid fading, his very identity as a Viking warrior stripped away piece by piece. To wield the power needed, the Thornkeeper's voice echoed from nowhere. You must become empty. The man who raised his daughter, who led his clan, who took pride in his strength, all of it must go. Are you willing? Bjorn watched his reflections lose everything that made him who he was. In the final mirror he saw himself transformed into something barely human, ageless, alien, forever cut off from the warmth of mortal connection. Yes, he whispered, though the word tore his heart like a dagger. For them, yes. The mirrors shattered, and he stumbled through into the final trial. The door of transformation opened onto a void that sang with the voices of stars being born. Here, cosmic forces pressed against his mind, offering knowledge that would remake him completely. He saw the true nature of reality, the connections between all living things, the delicate balance the bloodbound sought to destroy, the role he could play in preventing universal collapse. But the knowledge burned like acid through his consciousness. To comprehend such truths, his human mind would have to die and be reborn as something his own people might hunt as a monster. Behind him, all three doors began to collapse. The trials were unstable, too much power channeled too quickly. The Thornkeeper had warned him, but he'd been too desperate to listen. I accept, he cried into the singing void. Whatever I must become, reality exploded. When awareness returned, Bjorn lay broken on cold stone. The mystical hall had vanished, leaving only the mountain ledge where he'd started. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. His connection to the cosmic knowledge flickered and died like a snuffed candle. The spirit's acceptance felt hollow, distant. The sacrifice he'd offered had been rejected. The Thornkeeper knelt beside him, her ancient face etched with sorrow. You attempted too much too quickly. The trials require time, preparation, spiritual readiness you do not possess. In the valley below, the aurora was fading. Saga's light growing dim. My people. Bjorn struggled to rise, but his body wouldn't obey. The failed trials had left him drained, powerless. Are beyond your help now, the Thornkeeper finished gently. You sought to shortcut wisdom, warrior. Some paths cannot be rushed, no matter how desperate the need. As if to confirm her words, the distant lights of Ironhold began to wink out one by one. Bjorn stared at the dying lights of his village, each extinguished glow a life snuffed out, and something inside him shattered completely. Not his body this time, that had already been broken by the trials. This was deeper, more fundamental, the last vestiges of the man who had sailed to these shores as a young raider, who had built Ironhold with bloodied hands and fierce pride, crumbled to ash. No. The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute refusal. I will not accept this. The Thornkeeper's ancient eyes widened. Bjorn, you must understand. I understand everything now. He forced himself to his knees, then slowly, agonizingly to his feet. The cosmic knowledge he'd briefly touched was gone, yes, but something else remained. Something the trials had planted so deep that even failure couldn't uproot it. The pain of every life he'd taken still burned in his chest. The acceptance of necessary sacrifice still hollowed his bones. And the alien perspective that had nearly destroyed his mind had left behind a terrible clarity. He had been asking the wrong question. I sought power to save them, he said, staring down at Ironhold's fading lights. But salvation was never mine to give. The Thornkeeper rose slowly, studying him with new intensity. What do you mean? Bjorn turned to face her, and she stepped back at what she saw in his eyes. Not the desperate fury of a failed hero, but something infinitely more dangerous, understanding. Saga told me the land remembers everything. You showed me how every violent act severs the connections between living things. The trials revealed the cosmic forces that bind reality together. He gestured toward the dying aurora. But I was still thinking like a warrior, like someone who could take what he needed and impose his will through strength. Below them, another light winked out. His heart clenched, but his voice remained steady. The real revelation isn't about power, it's about choice. Every moment, every being faces the same fundamental decision, to connect or to sever, to heal or to wound, to preserve or to destroy. The Thornkeeper's expression shifted from sorrow to something approaching awe. "You cannot mean." The Bloodbound aren't just warriors wielding dark magic. They're the logical endpoint of the path my people have walked for generations. Endless conquest, endless expansion, endless taking without giving back. Bjorn's voice grew stronger as the truth crystallized in his mind. They represent what we become when we choose severance over connection, often enough that we forget any other way exists. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had wielded sword and axe, that had taken countless lives in service of Viking ambition. I cannot save my people by becoming something different. I can only save them by helping them choose differently. But the trials were never about gaining power over the situation. Bjorn felt the last of his old identity dissolve, not through cosmic transformation, but through simple, terrible comprehension. They were about understanding that the situation was always about power itself. The moment I decided I needed to become strong enough to solve this alone, I was already walking the blood-bound path. In the distance, the aurora wasn't just fading, it was changing. The ethereal ribbons of light began to pulse in rhythm with his words, as if the land itself was responding to this new understanding. Saga doesn't need me to save her. She needs me to trust her. My people don't need a mystically transformed savior. They need someone who can show them a different choice than the one their ancestors have been making for centuries. The Thornkeeper stared at him in silence for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a reverence he'd never heard before. In all my years tending the old ways, I have seen many seek the trials. Warriors, kings, shamans, wise women, all hoping to gain power sufficient to their challenges. You are the first to realize that the true trial was learning not to want power at all. Bjorn felt something shift in the air around them, as if reality itself was recognizing a fundamental change. The network of silver light he'd seen flowing through the forest began to pulse more brightly, not with alien energy, but with something as natural as breath. The connections can be rewoven, he said, understanding flooding through him. Not by force, but by choice. Every act of genuine sacrifice instead of taking, every moment of trust instead of control, every decision to preserve instead of destroy. He started toward the path leading back down to the valley, his body still weak but his purpose crystalline. "Where are you going?" the Thornkeeper called after him. "To give my people the only thing I actually have to offer," Bjorn replied without turning back. "The choice to be something different than what we've always been." Behind him, the aurora flared with sudden brilliance, and the lights of Ironhold began, impossibly, to rekindle. The descent from the mountain peak should have taken hours, but the silver paths that had seemed like mere tricks of moonlight now blazed beneath Bjorn's feet, carrying him downward with impossible speed. The aurora overhead pulsed in rhythm with his steps, and he realized that his transformation, not into something mystically powerful, but into something fundamentally different, had awakened responses throughout the ancient network that connected all living things. As he approached the tree line, familiar shapes emerged from the shadows between the pines. Thorvald stepped into view first, his grizzled face etched with exhaustion and something approaching desperation. Behind him came Ragnhild, her healing supplies clutched in white-knuckled hands, and then Olaf, supporting himself heavily on his walking stick. "Bjorn." Thorvald's voice cracked with relief. We saw the lights failing, and when the aurora began to change, he stopped, studying his friend's face in the ethereal glow. "Something's different about you." "Everything's different," Bjorn replied, but his tone carried none of the cosmic alienation they might have expected. Instead, he sounded more human than he had in years, as if some essential weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Tell me what's happened." Ragnhild stepped forward, her healer's instincts cataloguing the subtle changes in his bearing, the way he moved with less tension despite his obvious physical weakness. "The child, Saga. She's been calling for you. The aurora dimmed when you climbed toward the peak, but in the last few moments..." She gestured upward, where the lights now danced with renewed vigor. "It's as if something fundamental shifted." It did. Bjorn looked at each of them in turn, seeing not just his closest allies but the living embodiment of everything he'd fought to protect. But not in the way I expected. The power to save our people was never mine to claim. Olaf's weathered features creased in confusion. Then how? By giving them something more valuable than salvation, Bjorn interrupted gently, by offering them choice. As they made their way toward the village, more figures emerged from the forest. Warriors who had followed him across countless raids, farmers who had trusted his leadership, families who had built their lives under his protection. All of them bore the strain of recent trials, but something in Bjorn's presence seemed to kindle hope where despair had taken root. The Bloodbound haven't just been conquering territory, he explained as they walked. They've been severing the connections that bind communities together. Trust, shared purpose, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than individual survival. They turn people into isolated vessels for their power by making them forget they ever had any other choice. Thorvald nodded grimly. We've seen it in the conquered settlements. Neighbors turning on each other, warriors abandoning their oaths, entire clans dissolving into chaos. Because they believe strength comes from taking what you need, rather than giving what you can, Bjorn said. It's the same mistake I've been making for 20 years. The same mistake our entire culture has been making. They crested a small rise, and Ironhold spread before them in the valley below. But the village Bjorn had left was transformed. Where before individual houses had stood in rough clusters, now paths of silver light connected each dwelling to its neighbors, creating a web of luminous threads that pulsed with shared energy. At the center, where Saga rested, the light blazed brightest of all. She's been weaving us together, Ragnhild breathed in wonder. While we thought we were protecting her, she was binding our community into something stronger than the sum of its parts. Bjorn felt tears he hadn't shed in decades track down his cheeks. This was what the trials had been preparing him to understand. Not that he needed to become powerful enough to save everyone, but that salvation had always been a collective endeavor. Saga hadn't needed a mystical guardian. She had needed someone willing to trust in the connections she was creating, rather than trying to control them. The Thornkeeper was right about one thing, he said as they began the final approach to the village. The old ways are returning, but not as conquest or domination. They're returning as choice, the choice to be part of something larger than ourselves. A familiar voice rang out across the valley, clear and strong despite its youth. Saga stood at the threshold of the great hall, no longer the broken child he had found on the shore, but something radiant and ancient and utterly, recognizably human. You understand now, she called to him, and her words carried the weight of earth and sky and growing things. The connections were never broken. They were only forgotten, and what is forgotten can always be remembered again. As Bjorn entered his village, his home, surrounded by people who had chosen to trust rather than fear, to connect rather than conquer, he felt the last echoes of cosmic knowledge settle into practical wisdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the Bloodbound remained a threat that would test every bond they had forged. But tonight, strength gathered in the spaces between one heart and another. The warmth of homecoming lasted only until dawn broke grey and bitter across the mountains. Bjorn woke to the sound of war horns, not the familiar bronze instruments of his own people, but the bone-deep wailing of bloodbound siege calls that seemed to leach hope from the very air. He found Saga at the great hall's entrance, her small form silhouetted against the growing light. The silver threads connecting the village still pulsed with life, but they flickered now like candle flames in wind. "They're coming," she said without turning. "All of them. Every clan they've consumed, every warrior they've bound to their purpose." Her voice carried the weight of prophecy, but underneath lay something heartbreakingly mortal. Fear. They know what we're building here threatens everything they represent. Bjorn knelt beside her, his hand finding her shoulder. Through that simple contact, he felt the vast network she'd woven trembling under assault. Not physical attack, that would come later, but something worse. The Bloodbound were broadcasting waves of psychic poison, whispers that turned trust to suspicion and cooperation to paranoia. "How long?" he asked. "By midday. They'll be at our borders. By sunset. She finally turned to face him, and he saw in her ancient eyes the terrible clarity of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. By sunset, we must have chosen what we're willing to die for. The village stirred to wakefulness around them, but not with the chaotic panic Bjorn had expected. The connections Saga had fostered held firm, creating a calm efficiency that would have been impossible in the old days of individual ambition and competing loyalties. Warriors gathered weapons without boasting. Families prepared defenses without hoarding resources. Children were shepherded to safety by neighbors who treated them as their own. Thorvald approached, his battle gear already in place, but his expression troubled. The scouts report something we've never seen before. The Bloodbound aren't just bringing warriors, they're herding the conquered populations before them like living shields. Entire villages forced to march at spear point. Bjorn felt the revelation hit like a physical blow. This was the consequence of his earlier choices, of every raid he'd led and every act of violence he'd justified. The Bloodbound were wielding his people's own brutality against them, turning the victims of Viking expansion into weapons. They know we've changed, he realized aloud. They know we won't simply cut through innocence to reach our true enemies. Saga nodded gravely. The connections work both ways. The same empathy that makes us stronger also makes us vulnerable to those who would exploit mercy. But instead of despair, Bjorn felt something crystallizing in his chest, a certainty forged in the trial's fire and tempered by hard-won wisdom. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping across the village where people moved with shared purpose, where individual strength had been multiplied rather than diminished by unity. Then we'll give them a choice they don't expect, he said. Not the choice between conquest and submission, but between connection and isolation. He turned to address the gathering crowd, villagers who had followed him through countless struggles, but had never heard him speak like this. Without the authority of command, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had finally learned the difference between power and strength. The Bloodbound believe they can force us to break our bonds by threatening what we protect. They think mercy is weakness, that caring makes us brittle. His voice carried clearly in the morning air, reaching every corner of the village through the silver network that amplified not just sound but intent. They're about to learn they're wrong. Ragnhild stepped forward, her healer's supplies transformed into something that looked more like ritual implements. What do you need from us? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Not what he would command, but what he would ask. The distinction felt like the difference between the man he had been and the man he was choosing to become. Trust, he said simply. Trust in each other, trust in what we've built, and trust that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to fight on your enemy's terms. Around him, he felt the village commit, not to him as a leader, but to each other as a community. The silver threads blazed brighter, and for a moment, the approaching threat felt distant as starlight. But on the northern horizon, a dark stain was spreading across the winter sky. The Bloodbound came like a cancer in the world's flesh, and by evening everything they had built would face its ultimate test. Bjorn looked at his hands, no longer stained only with blood, but capable of building something worth defending. The final confrontation would demand everything they had become and everything they might yet choose to be. The old way of solving problems with violence was ending. What came next would define not just their survival but their souls. The dark stain on the horizon resolved into something far worse than an army. As the sun climbed higher, Bjorn could make out the true horror of what approached, a writhing mass of humanity driven forward like cattle, with the crimson banners of the Bloodbound rising behind them like bloody teeth. Thousands, Thorvald breathed beside him, lowering the bronze spyglass with shaking hands. They've emptied entire regions, every settlement between here and the eastern fjords. Through the silver network, Bjorn felt the village's collective intake of breath as the scope of the challenge became clear. But instead of breaking under the weight of impossibility, the connections held firm. Years of raiding had taught him to read the mood of warriors before battle, the subtle signs of courage failing, of men already half convinced of defeat. What he felt now was different. Determination without desperation, resolve without the brittle edge of fear. Saga's small hand slipped into his, and through that contact he experienced the approaching horde through her ancient perception. The conquered peoples weren't just hostages. They were being consumed from within, their life force slowly drained to fuel the bloodbound's dark magic. Men who had once been farmers and fishers now stumbled forward with hollow eyes, their will so thoroughly broken that escape would require more energy than their depleted spirits possessed. "They're feeding on despair," she whispered. Every moment of hopelessness, every severed connection, every act of betrayal forced upon the innocent, it all flows back to strengthen our enemies. But Bjorn was beginning to see the pattern differently. The trials had shown him how all living things were bound together by invisible threads of energy. What the bloodbound perceived as strength, their ability to sever those connections and claim the released power, was actually a fundamental weakness. They had made themselves parasites, dependent on others' life force, because they had forgotten how to generate their own. "Olaf," he called to the old skald, who was binding protective charms to his walking stick with steady hands. "Tell me about the winter when your grandfather's grandfather faced the ice giants." The request seemed absurd, with catastrophe bearing down upon them, but the villagers had learned to trust Bjorn's unconventional thinking. Olaf's weathered face creased in concentration as he reached back through generations of oral tradition. He couldn't match their strength, the old man recited, couldn't break their weapons or breach their fortress. So instead he gave them fire, not as a weapon, but as a gift, reminded them what warmth felt like after centuries of cold. The giants remembered their connection to the living world, and chose to return to the deep mountains rather than destroy what they had forgotten they once loved. Exactly what Bjorn had hoped to hear. The old stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for impossible situations, wisdom preserved across generations for moments precisely like this. "Ragnhild," he said, turning to the healer, "how much of your fever root tea do we have?" She blinked in confusion. "Enough for the whole village, but why would we—" Understanding dawned across her features like sunrise. "You mean to offer it to them? To the conquered ones?" "Not just tea," Bjorn said, his voice growing stronger as the plan crystallized. "Food, warm clothes, medicine, everything we would offer to our own people in distress." He gestured toward the silver network that connected every household. "The bloodbound have turned mercy into a weapon against us. But what if we turned mercy into a weapon against them?" Through Saga's connection to the land itself, he could feel the approaching army like a wound in the world's flesh. But he could also sense something else, the faint but persistent threads that still connected the conquered peoples to their true selves, buried deep but not entirely severed. The bloodbound's power depended on maintaining those people's despair. Acts of genuine kindness, offered without expectation of return, might be enough to remind them that other choices existed. "They'll see it as weakness," Thorvald warned. "They'll think we're surrendering." "Good," Bjorn replied. "Let them think that. While they're trying to understand why we're feeding their hostages instead of fighting them, those same hostages will be remembering what it feels like to be cared for rather than consumed." He looked around at his people, no longer his followers, but his partners in this impossible gamble. Warriors were already setting aside weapons to help carry cauldrons. Farmers brought forward stores of grain they had been hoarding against winter's end. Children gathered blankets that still held the warmth of home. "This is madness," someone muttered from the crowd. "Yes," Bjorn agreed readily. "The old kind of sanity led us here, to a world where conquest breeds only greater conquest, where strength is measured by how much you can take rather than how much you can give. If that's sanity, then madness is exactly what we need." The dark stain on the horizon had become a visible tide of human misery, and behind it, the true bloodbound forces gleamed like drops of poison in an open wound. Everything they had learned, everything they had become, would be tested in the hours ahead. The first of the conquered reached Ironhold's borders as the sun touched its zenith. They came stumbling across the frozen ground like sleepwalkers, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky as marionettes controlled by cruel hands. Behind them, the true blood-bound forces waited, crimson-cloaked figures whose very presence seemed to leach color from the world. Bjorn stood at the village's edge, a steaming cauldron of Ragnhild's fever root tea beside him, warm bread wrapped in clean cloth at his feet. The silver network thrummed with nervous energy but held firm. Every villager knew their part in this impossible gamble. The first conquered soul to approach was a woman perhaps 30 winters old, her once proud bearing reduced to a shuffling gait. Blood-bound runes carved into her forehead pulsed with sickly light, and her hands trembled with exhaustion. She stopped just beyond sword's reach, swaying on her feet. "I bring you death," she said in a voice not entirely her own. "Surrender now, and your end will be swift." Bjorn ladled tea into a wooden cup, the aromatic steam rising between them like incense. "I bring you warmth," he replied gently, extending the cup. "Take it, and remember what choice feels like." For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, the woman stared at the offered cup. The runes on her forehead flared brighter, and Bjorn could feel the blood-bound masters pouring their will through the psychic chains that bound her. But he could also feel something else, the faintest spark of the person she had been before conquest broke her spirit. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the cup. From the ranks behind her came a sound like rending metal. Rage given voice. A figure in flowing crimson robes emerged from the mass of conquered souls, and Bjorn found himself face to face with his true enemy for the first time. The blood-bound commander was tall as a man, but moved with inhuman grace. Where its face should have been, only darkness dwelt beneath the hood, shot through with veins of pulsing red light. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere at once. "You would corrupt our instruments with sentiment?" The voice carried the weight of collapsing mountains. "These creatures exist to serve strength. You offer them the weakness that led to their enslavement." "I offer them choice," Bjorn replied, still holding out the cup. Around him, he felt his people moving into position, not for battle, but for service. Thorvald carried blankets. Olaf bore fresh bread. Children brought small tokens of comfort, toys and trinkets that spoke of home and safety. The blood-bound commander laughed, a sound like winter wind through grave markers. "Choice? Look upon our great work, Viking. Every soul here chose surrender over death. They chose survival over honor. Choice led them to us." "No," said Saga, stepping forward to stand beside Bjorn. Her young voice carried the authority of ancient stone. "Despair led them to you. You offered them a false choice, submit or die. We offer them a true one, remain broken or remember who they were." The woman with the branded forehead was trembling now, caught between competing forces. The cup in Bjorn's hand steamed peacefully, a simple vessel containing warmth and healing. Everything hung on what she would choose. "You cannot save them all," the commander hissed, its form beginning to swell with dark power. "Even if you break our hold on these few, thousands more will take their place. We are conquest itself given form. We are the inevitable result of your own violence returned threefold." Bjorn felt the weight of every raid he had led, every village he had burned, every innocent life lost to his ambition. The bloodbound was right. This horror was built from the foundation of Viking brutality. But the trials had taught him that understanding the source of a wound was the first step toward healing it. "You're right," he said quietly. "You are what we became when we forgot that strength shared is strength multiplied. But that's not what we choose to remain." The woman's hand closed around the cup. The instant her fingers touched the warm wood, light blazed along the silver network. Not the harsh glare of magic, but the gentle radiance of connection restored. The runes on her forehead flickered and died. For a moment that lasted forever, she stood fully herself again. Then she smiled, an expression so genuine and unexpected that it hit the assembled crowd like lightning. She raised the cup to her lips and drank deeply. The bloodbound commander shrieked in fury, its form expanding into something vast and terrible. "Then you have chosen extinction. We will drown your mercy in oceans of blood. But Bjorn was no longer looking at the monster. He was watching as more conquered souls stumbled forward, drawn by the impossible sight of genuine kindness offered without condition. In their hollow eyes, the faintest sparks of hope began to kindle. The true battle was just beginning. The blood-bound commander's rage manifested as literal darkness, tendrils of shadow that lashed out toward the growing circle of freed souls. Where the darkness touched, grass withered and stone cracked. But as it reached for the woman who had chosen the cup, the silver network blazed brighter, creating a barrier of interconnected light. Impossible, the creature hissed. We severed those bonds. We consumed their connections. You severed the chains you forged, Saga replied, her small hand finding Bjorn's. But the deeper connections, the ones that bind all living things, those can only be abandoned, never truly broken. More conquered souls pressed forward, drawn by the sight of their companion's transformation. The woman who had drunk the tea was helping distribute bread now, her movements growing steadier with each act of service. As she touched others, the branded runes began flickering and dying like candles in a breeze. But Bjorn could feel the true cost of this victory approaching. Through the silver network, he sensed something vast and hungry stirring in the depths of the blood-bound host. The commander had been merely a lieutenant. Behind it rose something that made the winter wind seem warm by comparison. "The Devourer comes," Saga whispered, her ancient eyes wide with fear that cut through Bjorn like ice. This was always the plan. Use the conquered souls as bait, draw us into spending our strength on mercy, then unleash what we cannot hope to face. On the northern horizon, the sky began to darken, though the sun still shone overhead. The remaining conquered souls fell to their knees in unison, their life force being drawn away to fuel something monstrous. The very air grew thick with malevolent power. Bjorn felt the silver network strain under the assault. Villagers gasped as psychic pressure hammered against their minds. The connections that had made them strong now made them vulnerable. Every link became a conduit for the Devourer's influence. "We have to sever the network," Thorvald said through gritted teeth, blood trickling from his nose as he fought against the mental invasion. "It's the only way to protect." "No." The word came from Bjorn with absolute certainty. He could feel what cutting the connections would cost, not just their tactical advantage, but everything they had become. They would survive as individuals, but the community that had transformed them would die. Yet as the Devourer's presence grew stronger, he realized the terrible arithmetic of their situation. The network that connected every villager also connected every conquered soul they had freed. To save dozens, they were exposing hundreds to psychic annihilation. Through Saga's eyes, he glimpsed the approaching entity, a writhing mass of severed connections, feeding on isolation and despair. It was what the blood-bound truly served, the antithesis of community, the negation of bonds between living things. "There is another way," Saga said quietly. "But the cost," Bjorn already knew. The trials had prepared him for this moment, though he hadn't understood at the time. To defeat something that fed on severed connections, someone would have to become the ultimate connection, a living bridge between all the network's scattered fragments. But the human mind wasn't meant to hold that much awareness simultaneously. He looked around at his people, Ragnhild healing the freed souls, Olaf sharing stories that reminded broken spirits of better times, Thorvald standing ready to defend what they had built. They had followed him through the transformation from raiders to protectors. Now he would lead them one final time. "Bjorn." "No," Saga breathed, reading his intention through their bond. "The network will burn through your mind in moments. You'll die, and we'll lose everything anyway. Will we?" He knelt to her level, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Look deeper. Look at what we've actually built here." Through her ancient perception, he showed her what he had come to understand. The silver network wasn't dependent on any single node. It was the sum of all their individual choices to care for one another, even if the visible threads were severed. The habits of cooperation, the muscle memory of compassion, the hard-won wisdom of shared strength, all of that would remain. "You don't need me to guide the network anymore," he said softly. "You never did. I was just the excuse you used to trust each other." The Devourer's shadow fell across the village, and Bjorn felt his decision crystallize into action. He opened his mind fully to the silver network, letting every connection flow through his consciousness simultaneously. The sensation was like trying to hold an ocean in a teacup. Overwhelming, impossible, beautiful. Through 1,000 eyes, he saw the Devourer recoil as its feast of isolation suddenly became a banquet of unity. Through 1,000 hearts, he felt the conquered souls remembering what it meant to belong somewhere. Through 1,000 voices, he spoke a single word that echoed across the psychic battlefield. Choose. The network blazed like a star going nova, and Bjorn felt his individual self dissolving into something larger than any one person could contain. The light faded gradually, like dawn in reverse. Bjorn found himself lying on familiar ground, staring up at a sky that seemed impossibly clear after the darkness that had consumed it. His body felt strange, lighter somehow, as if he had shed some essential weight. When he tried to sit up, gentle hands pressed him back down. "Easy," Ragnhild's voice, warm with relief and tinged with something like awe. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. We weren't sure you'd come back to us." "Come back." The words carried more meaning than she knew. Bjorn's memories of the final moments were fractured, fragments of experiencing existence through countless perspectives simultaneously, of being everyone and no one all at once. He remembered the Devourer's shriek as it encountered not the isolated minds it expected to consume, but an unbreakable web of connection. Then, nothing. "Did we?" His voice came out as a croak. "We won." Thorvald appeared in his field of vision, grinning despite the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Though "won" might not be the right word for what happened. Bjorn managed to prop himself up on his elbows. Around him, the village bustled with activity, but it was different from before. The silver threads of connection were gone, or rather, they were no longer visible. Yet he could feel something deeper in their place, something that didn't require his consciousness to maintain. People moved with the easy coordination of a body's parts, each person naturally filling the spaces where they were most needed. Among the villagers worked dozens of strangers, the conquered souls, he realized. But they no longer bore the hollow-eyed look of the enslaved. They laughed as they helped rebuild damaged structures, their movements free and purposeful. "What happened to the bloodbound?" Bjorn asked. Saga emerged from behind a group of children who were weaving flower chains with the intensity of military strategists. She looked older somehow, though still very much a 7-year-old girl. They fled when the Devourer fell, without its hunger to guide them. They're just lost souls clinging to old habits of cruelty. They'll find new purposes in time, or fade away entirely. She settled beside him, her ancient eyes studying his face with careful attention. "How do you feel? Being singular again?" Bjorn considered the question. During the climactic battle, he had experienced consciousness as a vast network, his individual identity dissolving into something collective and overwhelming. Now he was simply himself again. Bjorn Ironwolf, former raider, current, what? The old titles no longer seemed to fit. "Smaller," he said finally. "But not empty. It's like..." He searched for the right comparison. Like being a single voice in a choir instead of trying to sing all the parts at once. Thorvald laughed. "That's one way to put it, though I'd say you managed the full choir rather well when it counted." Over the following days, as Bjorn recovered his strength, he began to understand the true scope of what had changed. The network still existed, but it had evolved beyond his ability to perceive or control it. The connections flowed naturally now, as unconscious as breathing. When someone needed help, others appeared without being asked. When conflicts arose, they resolved through instinctive compromise rather than dominance. The freed souls integrated seamlessly into this new dynamic. Many chose to stay in Ironhold, while others set out to return to their original homes, but now as carriers of something precious, They bore with them the living proof that communities could exist without conquest, that strength could flow from cooperation rather than subjugation. "You realize what you've done," Olaf said one evening as they sat around the central fire. "You've made yourself obsolete. Nobody needs a war chief when there are no more wars to fight." Bjorn smiled, watching children play a new game they had invented, something involving careful balance and mutual support rather than winners and losers. "Good. That was always the point." But Saga looked thoughtful. "The change isn't limited to our village. I can feel it spreading, ripples moving outward as people carry this new way of being to other communities. Some will embrace it, others will resist. The old patterns of violence won't disappear overnight." "No," Bjorn agreed. "But they don't have to disappear everywhere at once. Just one heart at a time. One choice to see strangers as potential family rather than potential prey." He thought of his daughter, lost to plague so many years ago. He would never know if she might have grown up in a world like this, a world where a small girl could walk safely through any village, confident that someone would offer her warmth and shelter simply because she needed it. But perhaps other children would have that chance. The fire crackled peacefully, surrounded by the quiet conversations of people who no longer needed to guard their words or their backs. In the distance, new songs drifted from the workshops where former enemies worked side by side, creating beauty instead of weapons. Bjorn closed his eyes and felt the vast, invisible web of connection that now spanned far beyond their small village. He was no longer its center or its guardian. He was simply one thread among many, precious for his individual contributions rather than his power over others. It was enough. It was everything. Weeks passed in this new rhythm, and Bjorn found himself walking paths that had once been as familiar as his own heartbeat, yet everything felt subtly transformed. The village bore the same structures, the same winding lanes between houses, but the quality of life within it had shifted so fundamentally that returning felt like visiting a dream made manifest. He paused at the harbor where his longship had once rested, the vessel that had carried him to countless raids, its hull stained with the memory of violence. Now children played where weapons had been stored, their laughter echoing off the wooden planks as they created elaborate games of cooperation. A young boy, one of the freed souls who had chosen to stay, was teaching the local children how to weave nets, not for catching fish, but for catching falling objects in their play. "Strange to see it like this," a familiar voice said behind him. Bjorn turned to find Eric approaching, his old raiding companion who had left months ago when the changes first began, declaring them madness and weakness. The man looked older, wearier, as if the weight of continuing the old ways had carved new lines in his weathered face. "Eric." Bjorn felt no anger at seeing him, only a deep sadness for the paths his friend had chosen. "What brings you back?" "Curiosity, mostly." Eric's hand rested on his sword hilt, an unconscious gesture that spoke of habits too ingrained to break easily. "Word spreads, you know. Stories of the village that turned away from war. Some call it madness, others—" He paused, watching the children play. "Others say you've discovered something worth more than gold." They stood in comfortable silence. Two men whose friendship had been forged in violence, but now faced the question of whether it could survive the absence of it. Bjorn remembered the countless raids they had planned together, the battles they had fought side by side, the easy camaraderie of shared brutality. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, not rejected, but outgrown like childhood clothing. "I've been watching you," Eric continued, "from the tree line these past few days, trying to understand what I'm seeing. You move differently now, all of you, like you're part of something larger." "We are," Bjorn said simply, "just as we always were. We just forgot for a while." Eric's laugh held no humor. "You make it sound so simple. But I've tried, Bjorn. After leaving here, I attempted to lead my own band the way we used to. Raid, conquer, take what we needed. But something had changed in me. Every time I raised my sword against innocence, I heard—" He shook his head. "I heard her voice, the little girl, Saga, asking why." Bjorn turned to face his old friend fully. In Eric's eyes, he saw the war between old patterns and new understanding, a conflict he recognized intimately. She has that effect on people. Where is she? I expected to see her the moment I arrived. Playing with the other children, I imagine. Or perhaps teaching the elders some forgotten story. She comes and goes as she pleases now, no longer bound to the role of mystical guide. Just a girl who happens to remember things others have forgotten. Eric's hand fell away from his sword. And you? What's your role now that there are no raids to plan, no warriors to lead? The question struck at the heart of Bjorn's own ongoing transformation. For so many years, his identity had been inseparable from his function as a war chief. Strength measured by fear inspired, worth calculated in plunder taken, purpose defined by the next conquest. The dissolution of that framework had left him unmoored initially, but gradually, something far richer had emerged in its place. I help where I'm needed, Bjorn said. Yesterday I worked with the shipbuilder, learning to create vessels for exploration rather than war. Tomorrow I might assist with the harvest, or help settle a dispute between neighbors. Not because I command it, but because it needs doing and I have hands to help. But surely you miss it. The clarity of purpose that comes with war, the simple mathematics of victory and defeat. Bjorn considered this carefully. I miss the certainty, he admitted. War makes every decision binary, attack or retreat, kill or be killed, win or lose. There's a terrible comfort in that simplicity, but I've learned that true strength isn't about making simple choices, it's about embracing complexity with wisdom. He gestured toward the village around them. Look closely, Eric. What you see isn't the absence of strength, it's strength reimagined. These people would fight to defend what they've built, but they no longer need to fight to prove their worth. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze following the movement of villagers about their daily tasks. Former enemies worked alongside old friends. Children who had once cowered from raiding parties now approached strangers with curiosity rather than fear. The conquered souls who had stayed moved with the quiet dignity of people who had remembered their own value. Could there be a place for someone like me? Eric asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone whose hands are still stained with recent blood? Bjorn smiled, remembering his own doubts, his own sense of unworthiness. There's a place for anyone willing to learn a new way of being strong. As the days turned to weeks, Eric's question found its answer not in words, but in action. Bjorn watched his old friend struggle with unfamiliar rhythms, the way conversations here built bridges rather than established dominance, how conflicts dissolved through patience rather than force. Eric's first instinct remained to solve problems with his blade, but gradually other tools appeared in his hands, a hammer for building, a net for fishing, gentle words for comforting frightened children. The transformation wasn't swift or easy. Some nights, Bjorn found Eric staring toward the northern mountains, his warrior's instincts calling him back to simpler certainties. But each dawn brought new opportunities to choose differently, and slowly, the man who had once found purpose only in conquest began discovering meaning in creation. It's harder than fighting, Eric admitted one evening as they repaired fishing nets by lamplight. In battle, I knew exactly who I was. Here, I have to decide who I want to become, Bjorn nodded, remembering his own early struggles. The hardest battles are always with ourselves. Saga appeared beside them as silently as falling snow, her small hands joining theirs in the delicate work of mending. She had grown in the months since the Devourer's defeat, not just in height, but in the easy confidence of a child who belonged somewhere absolutely. The ancient weight she had carried seemed lighter now, shared among the entire community rather than borne alone. The threads we weave now will hold, she said, her voice carrying the subtle echo of deeper wisdom. Not just the nets, but all of it. The connections, the choices, the new stories we tell ourselves about what strength means. Eric studied her with something approaching wonder. Do you really remember everything? All the old hurts, all the cycles of violence? I remember, Saga confirmed. But memory isn't just about the past. It's about choosing what patterns to repeat and what patterns to break. You're helping write new memories now. Better ones. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. A small group of strangers emerged from the darkness. Travelers by their dress, worn and weary from long roads. Once, such unexpected arrivals would have triggered immediate suspicion and defensive preparations. Now, villagers emerged from their homes with offers of food and shelter before the newcomers could even ask. Bjorn watched the familiar dance of hospitality unfold, strangers becoming guests, fear transforming into welcome. Among the travelers, he recognized the signs he had learned to read, people fleeing something, carrying wounds both visible and hidden. Once he might have seen them as potential threats or sources of valuable information to be extracted. Now he simply saw fellow human beings in need of kindness. "Where have you come from?" Ragnhild asked as she examined a child's infected wound with gentle expertise. "The eastern settlements," replied the group's leader, a middle-aged woman whose eyes held the haunted quality of recent trauma. "Raiders came in the night. We barely escaped." The word raiders sent a ripple of recognition through the gathered villagers. Many here had once worn that title themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They had become the shelter people sought from the very violence they had once perpetrated. "You're safe here," Bjorn said simply. "For as long as you need." The woman's eyes found his, taking in the scars that marked him clearly as a former warrior. Instead of fear, she saw recognition, of shared understanding, of someone who had walked through darkness and emerged carrying light. As the evening progressed, the travelers shared their story. The raiders who had destroyed their homes weren't driven by starvation or desperation, but by the old patterns of dominance and conquest. They took what they wanted simply because they could, left destruction simply because it felt like power. They called themselves the Iron Wolves, one of the refugees mentioned, and Bjorn felt Eric stiffen beside him. "Your former name," Eric murmured. "Someone's taken it up." Bjorn considered this without anger. Names were just words. It was the actions behind them that carried meaning. Let others claim the title of Iron Wolf if they chose. He had become something better than any name could contain. "Will you go after them?" the woman asked, and Bjorn heard the complex hope in her voice, the desire for justice warring with the fear of more violence. "No," he said after a moment. "But we'll do something more important. We'll make sure they have no more victims to create." The refugees looked confused, but Saga smiled with ancient understanding. The network that had begun in Ironhold continued to spread, not through conquest, but through example. Communities were learning new ways to be strong, new definitions of victory that didn't require creating losers. Years passed like seasons, each one adding layers to the new story they were writing. Children grew up knowing cooperation as naturally as their parents had once known conflict. Former enemies became family. The old songs of glory in battle gave way to new ballads celebrating the courage of compassion. On a morning bright with promise, Bjorn stood where he had once found a bloodied child speaking impossible truths. Saga, now a young woman but still bearing her timeless wisdom, stood beside him. The shore stretched endlessly before them, no longer a staging ground for raids but a gateway to infinite possibilities. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing this path?" Bjorn smiled, feeling the weight of contentment in his chest. Around them, the village hummed with the quiet strength of people who had learned to build rather than break, to heal rather than wound, to love rather than fear. "Never," he said. "This is what victory actually looks like."